What do you worship? What do you worship? That may seem like an odd question. Most of us probably do not think of ourselves as worshiping anything. I mean, we come to church to worship God, certainly. But outside these walls, worship is probably not a word that many of us use in our daily lives. Saint Augustine of Hippo, who became one of the great early theologians of the church, believed that worship was precisely the question at the heart of every human life. Augustine spent years of his own life searching for happiness, searching for success, searching for wisdom, searching for meaning. When he finally found God as the source of his life's fulfillment, he looked back over his life and, speaking to God, he famously wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." In that single sentence, Augustine named something profoundly true about human nature, and that is that every single human heart is searching for something around which to organize a life, something to love, something to trust, something to serve, something that gives meaning and purpose to everything else. And because we are searching, I think we are often tempted to place our hope in things that cannot ultimately bear the weight that we place upon them. St. Paul sees the same dynamic at work in today's reading from his letter to the Romans. Paul uses language that is uncomfortable to our modern ears. He speaks about slavery, about being slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. We cannot hear these words without remembering the terrible history of slavery in our world and in our own country. So it is important to acknowledge that Paul's metaphor is difficult. Yet listen carefully to the question that Paul raises to the Roman Christians. Do you know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? Paul is not talking here about legal ownership. He's talking about allegiance, about loyalty, about the powers that shape our lives, about the things that claim our devotion, about the things that we trust most deeply. I think Paul and Augustine are actually asking the same question. What occupies the center of your life? What has your allegiance? What do you worship? Now, when Christians hear a sermon about idolatry, we often imagine something obvious, a golden calf, an ancient statue, something we can literally bow down towards. But most of us are not tempted to bow down before carved images. And yet, idols have not disappeared. Perhaps they have simply become harder to recognize. They often take the form of things that we trust to give us what only God can give. And so we worship money because we are afraid. We worship success because we want to matter. We worship work and productivity because we want to prove ourselves. We worship power because we want control. We worship our nation because we want to belong. We worship whiteness because it promises us privilege. We worship ourselves because we do not want to have to depend on others. None of this is new. Human beings have always looked for something other than God to give us security, identity, meaning, and purpose. That is why Augustine says our hearts are restless. And it's why Paul asks who or what we worship. Because whatever sits at the center of our lives, it will eventually shape us. It will shape our priorities. It will shape our choices. It will shape the kinds of people we become. And so the question is not whether we will worship. The question is what will we worship, and whether it can ultimately give us all that it promises. That brings us to our gospel story this morning from Matthew's gospel, one of the most succinct gospel readings we will hear the whole year in church. And at the very end of today's reading, Jesus says something that I find a little bit surprising. He does not point to great achievements. He does not point to wealth. He does not point to power or influence. He points to a cup of cold water, a simple gesture of kindness, a genuine welcome, an ordinary expression of generosity. Not because such acts are small, but because they reveal what sits at the center of a person's life. And perhaps that is because what we worship eventually becomes visible in how we live. If money sits at the center of our life, that will become visible. If power sits at the center of our life, that will become visible. If fear sits at the center of our life, that will become visible. And if it is God who is at the center of our life, then that will be visible too. Maybe not always through big, dramatic acts, but perhaps more often through simple acts of love, a cup of cold water, a word of encouragement, making room for someone who might otherwise be left out, a willingness to notice and care for someone else. The things we worship will shape the people we become. So perhaps the question for us this morning is simply this: what occupies the center of your life? What has your allegiance? What is it that you worship? Because every human heart is searching for something around which to organize a life, something to trust, something to love, something to serve. And sooner or later, what we worship always becomes visible in the lives we build and the people we become. I'm not usually an Augustine person in sermons, but I wanted to close with a few more words of Saint Augustine. One Easter, he preached a sermon to a group of newly baptized Christians about the significance of the Eucharist, pointing to the altar where the bread and wine would become Christ's body and blood. He said, "Behold what you are, become what you receive." Or sometimes translated, "Be what you see, receive what you are." What was he talking about? Well, he meant that at this altar here, we worship the body of Christ. And as we receive the body of Christ, we are at the same time made more and more and more into his body. We behold the body of Christ, and we become the body of Christ. We become what we worship. In a few moments, we will all come to this altar. And we will all kneel, and we will hold out our hands to receive the body of Christ, our incarnate God. We will hold in our palms for a brief moment the Creator of the whole universe. And as we do so, we will declare again who it is that stands at the center of our lives, who has our allegiance, who is the end of all our searching, who it is we worship. May we who receive Christ's body be made more and more into his body. May we who worship Jesus in this holy meal be shaped into people who will bear his love into our broken world. And may we truly become what we receive.